My brain is still exploding with new designs for the Burst Block template I created recently, and I'm loving it. This is a fabulous 2-fabric design on the twist. Let's get started. I know thousands of you already have your own personal Burst Block template, and if you don't, you can get it right out of the description below. There's a link for you. Now, today I am using yardage because I wanted to use 2 of my favorite fabrics, solid and batik, and sometimes batiks are hard to get in pre-cut with the same fabric over and over again. So, the quilt behind me, you're gonna see batik and solid, very easy, and you're gonna need 3 yards of each fabric, plus a half a yard of whatever fabric you choose to use for your binding. It is really that simple. Before we start making the blocks themselves though, let's take our yardage and strip it down into 10-inch wide strips and then make 10-inch squares because the template itself is designed to work, as you can see, right off of 10-inch squares. When it's all done, you'll have piles and piles, or 40 each, of your batik and of your solid squares. And then we're gonna trim them all down at one time so we can just get started at the machine. So your batik, you're gonna take your Burst Block template, as you know, and we're gonna cut it to form 3 pieces, a wedge, and 2 triangles. These triangles are not equal-sided triangles. This side is longer than this side, so we wanna keep the orientation proper. When you take your solid piece, you can see this was just cut with a standard ruler to form 2 triangles, and those triangles are the same, so if you were to mix them and match them, it wouldn't be a problem, right? Now, we're only gonna need the template for the rest of the sewing and trimming, and we're gonna sew and trim as we go, and the first step is to slide those batik triangles up and out of the way, keeping the orientation as you need, and then your next step is gonna be to prepare for sewing. Now when you sew on your strips, I should say your triangles to your wedge, I want you to start with about 1/4 inch of overlap down on the small end of the wedge shape. So you're gonna stitch those on, and I've got one done to show you. And when you're finished, it's gonna come out just like this. Now, one of the things I find is easiest is to run my iron down the center and press these away from the center wedge. So that's something that I do through all of the steps. And then from here, we're gonna simply use our template to make all of the cuts. Now, what we've got is we have a wedge shape on the template, and that always lays on the wedge shape in your fabric piece. I have lines, they have a dot 1, dot 2, and dot 3. So the first one we're using, the first dot, is for the first seam allowance. The seam allowance runs right through here. And then the last little trick I do to make these accurate. Now, I gotta tell you, the secret in the quilt behind me though, they don't have to be very accurate. None of our points are gonna match up in the twisting version. We've actually called this quilt Gator. But Gator is very fluid and very freeing, but the good way to construct your blocks is to also watch the tip of your template right back here, and it's always going to line up somewhere on the back of that wedge as well. It helps you keep all of your angles straight. It's a mouthful. Let's start cutting. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to come in here, and I cut first the triangle off. I'm going to save my scraps. I need them for later. Then what I'm gonna do here is I had the 90-degree mark also on my template, line it up across the top, and I'm gonna cut off the long side. I'm not gonna cut off the small side, okay? Now, some of you may find you want to spin, so a Lazy Susan mat comes in very handy. Your wedge will be on the wedge. Your first stripe will be on that seam allowance or that first line. I'm also lining up the tip, so it doesn't matter if I'm working forward or backward. Coming in here, and I'm gonna slice. I'm gonna take that 90-degree, like I said, and I wanna line it up here on the top, and then in a second I'm gonna show you a very cool trick that I learned from one of my students. Okay, I don't need those little pieces, I will need those big triangles later. Now, I'm gonna rotate this back around one last time. I need to trim this small edge, and here's the trick with trimming the small edge. I'm actually gonna take my big wedge from the ruler, and I'm gonna line it up here. Then I line up the skinny tip up on the tip of the big part of the wedge. I know, Dr. Seuss wrote today's tutorial, right? And then I'm gonna trim off both pieces at once. And the reason I do it that way is I now have a very nice crisp 90-degree down here and up here, and the block will come out as square as we possibly can get it. We will still trim down at the end. Okay, so I know that was a lot of info on the first cut. We're gonna do those same steps over and over again. I'm gonna start to speed up the process though. So I have the wedges, the wedge and the triangle. Now I'm bringing these back in. This is also crucial. Remember I told you, you have a long edge, it lines up to the short side. You have the shorter edge, it lines up to the long side. We're going to stitch these on also with about a 1/4 inch seam allowance running long down here. And when those are finished, they're going to look just like this. Okay, we'll take those, like I said earlier, and we're going to press them. So again, I'm just pressing out of the center wedge, out and out, like yay. Then I'm going to drop that back on the Lazy Susan, grab my template, and we're going to start going through the steps pretty quick. Hang on, seatbelts buckled, wedge on the wedge. Second line, second seam allowance. I line up the tip back here as I'm getting ready to slice. And yes, it will line up on the opposite side for the next cut, but it still gives us a good accurate. Go to my 90, trim it away. If you don't want to rotate, you can do it this way too. Wedge on wedge, second line, second seam, tip on tip. And then what I do for this cut though, if I'm not going to rotate, hold with my right hand, slow down so I don't push away from the wedge and the template. Got what I need. And now we're going to start cutting off this using the 90. And on the bottom end, we can also use the 90 the same way now. So I've got the 90 down here, lining it up because I had a good cut from that first start. And again, whoop, like that. And we're going to rotate and repeat, rotate and repeat. Bringing on the new triangles. The new triangles are also no longer equal sided, so you want to make sure you're lining up your long side to your short corners. Stitch those on with that tip hanging loose, and guess what? We're going to have yet another piece come right out of the sewing machine looking just like that. Isn't that great? Now, let me take a second and iron it because I want to use these blocks when I'm all finished. Okay, like this, beautiful. So we're now on our third cut. I've got my wedge on the wedge. I've got my 3 dots lines for my third seam allowance. The tip I'm still looking at down here. Oop, I slipped a little bit, so I'm just going to take a time and reset. 90 up here. Now, when I was working on this, I also was able to start doing what I consider chain piecing. So I was able to take each of the 40 blocks and do one step at a time, but to all 40. And it does definitely work, especially when you're using all of the same fabrics, because you are not worried about accidentally intermixing different fabrics or different colors. So it was a fun way to make a very efficient and quick project as well. And now I'm chatting and not paying attention to my cutting, so let's get those last little tails. Now, one last thing I want to point out for construction, and I'm actually going to show you as we sew on this last piece, right? I'm going to get my little wedge down here. This bottom end, we have kind of an interesting seam allowance starting to form. So look really close here. It's not through the entire light green solid fabric. It's just from here to here. So when I go to mount on this last piece like this, I want to make sure that I'm stitching through, but when I open it up, I'll still have the little bit of the light green down there showing. And I believe I actually have that prepped out for us, like this, okay? Now, let me press that as well so I can show you the last cut, because the last cut you're just going to square. And I normally use the Burst Block template itself for squaring things up. But I have been teaching this workshop to a lot of different folks out there in person, and it's wonderful when you're teaching in person because we bounce and share ideas back and forth, right? So what I'm trying to say is I normally will use my template like this to continue to square. I could just cut it a line, very easy. but some folks are more precise and more accurate than I am, I guarantee it. And so I also watched a lot of folks starting to square with a big square. Now, I want to teach you this trick, just because it's something new I can show. When you're squaring with a big square like this, I'm going to find my most obvious 90-degree corner, the one we created and started with, okay? And then I'm going to come back here, and I'm looking at the number 10, and then I'm going to slide it down, and I'm also looking here at 10, 10, so that I can actually make what would be 2 cuts at once. That's the best way to get it nice and square. So I'm kind of looking at my outside edge, but I'm really mostly watching down in here. And now that I have it squared this way, I can come across and cut there, and I can cut here. Okay, so I've done all of that trim work, and then have I rotated all the way around, I'm going to find that same 10, 10 mark down on the bottom corner, but I can also now, that was the part I trimmed off earlier while we were talking about using the template, right? So you can come that off, and then you're going to have 4 of these perfect burst block blocks. Now, the fun of this quilt is, like I said earlier, you don't have to be accurate in your work. Okay, so if you had fabric that shifted or the bias got in front of you, something like that, you don't have to be concerned. An original burst block goes together with all of those wedges coming in like this. Okay, and this is where that accuracy used to matter. But for this, we don't have to worry at all. So I take one burst and I rotate, and I rotate, and I rotate, and I rotate like this until I have this awesome twisting design, just like you saw in that free printable, and then I bring them back over to the quilt and I start to lay them out. Now, what I had was some fun with this one. I kind of got some interesting odd numbers going. Started with 40 blocks, but I ended up with a 5x8 layout. So if you look over here, I've got kind of a bursting twist, and over here I have more of the circular twisting twist, and opposites in the corner. So it's really fun as you go through the project that way. So all of the blocks, I built the 4 twists and I set them in there and perimetered them with the extra 2. You can design it any way you like, right? It will work however. Then the fun came in the free motion machine quilting. In this particular project, I have a couple of different motifs, a straight line motif and just a simple curved motif. And as a matter of fact, let me bring this quilt to the back so you can see it. I never show the back, but we're gonna show the back right now. So you can see the high contrast in the thread and everything. Really fun and really exciting. You can maybe even see the stitches a little bit better. But what I want to point out is to keep it straight in my brain, I basically did straight line style quilting in the solid and curved style quilting in the batik. And what that allowed me to do was still start in the middle like a good quilter would, but radiate outward using 2 different motifs, but never losing track of where I was. It was the most gratifying and simplistic approach to not marking a quilt that I've experienced this far. So give it a try. And I think the burst block thing is getting to be a bit addictive. So I'm gonna make more and more and more and more, and we'll catch you next time at Man Sewing.